Welcome to biology. So this first chapter is going to take us through kind of the unifying themes of biology and science in general. And biology is bio means life and ology means the study of. So the very first thing we have to do when we talk about a biology class is figure out what is life. So what are we going to be looking at? And we define living as something that has all of these properties of life. So the first requirement for being considered a living thing is having order. So if you look at this inside of this sunflower here, you can see that everything is organized. We show order in a lot of different magnitudes. We show order at the size of atoms. By being placed in the correct order, your proteins either work or don't work. If you think about your body, so you have a head, shoulder, knees, toes in that order. And all of our humans have the same order to our body structures. And if you mixed up where your head and your toes were, you wouldn't work quite as well as you do now. Living things are not just randomly made in whatever order they want. You actually have genetic sequences that tell your body which end is the front and which end is the back. Organisms also need to be able to evolve, so evolutionary adaptation. If you can't see it, check out this seahorse here. She's wrapped around this piece of coral, and the seahorse looks exactly like this salmon-colored piece of coral. And over time, the genetic sequences for this group of seahorse that match their background become advantageous because they aren't as easily spotted by other fish, and so maybe they can reproduce more often. And after many, many years, many, many generations, you end up with seahorses that look like the coral they live on. So now imagine that there's catastrophic climate change and this coral reef dies out and the seahorse has to move to a green grass environment. Is that seahorse going to do as well there? Probably not. It's either going to die off or it's going to have to adapt again. All living things are made up of cells. It can be really simple cells like bacteria that have a membrane. They don't even have a nucleus. They have some DNA, some ribosomes, and they can divide and reproduce. Or we can have complicated eukaryotic cells that have lots of different types of organelles that you're going to learn later on. Organisms need to be able to reproduce to be considered alive, and I mean reproduce on their own. So in the case of this giraffe, mommy giraffe meets daddy giraffe, they fall madly in love, they copulate, have a baby, and then you see baby giraffe here. Obviously not all reproduction works like that. Plants do reproduction very differently, and bacteria do reproduction just by dividing. You take one bacteria cell, divide it into two, now you have two bacteria cells. But it didn't need any kind of outside help. Viruses, for example, are not considered living things. Viruses cannot reproduce without a host to provide them with the machinery for their genetic instructions. So generally viruses are considered non-living in one part because they can't reproduce. Living things also need to respond to stimuli. You can see this Venus flytrap here, and there's a little grasshopper looking dude right in there. So Venus flytraps actually have little hairs called trigger hairs on the inside of here. And when the fly, where's my fly, walks onto those trigger hairs, it creates a stimulus. And the response to that stimulus is that the Venus flytrap closes its mouth. And then it uses digestive enzymes and it breaks the fly or the grasshopper down for its nitrogen. If you are outside at a socially distanced party and somebody calls your name, what do? You're going to turn and look at them, hopefully wearing your mask. And that is your response to stimuli, right? You're going to hear your name, that's the stimulus, and then you respond by turning and looking to where the sound came from. All living things must grow and develop. So growth meaning getting larger, but development means that they're also changing shape, right? So this plant started out as a seed, and it is going to not only grow larger, right? Seeds don't just turn into bigger seeds. Seeds develop through a progression of different shapes. They first have cotyledons and then roots and stems and leaves. You also grow and develop. So you as a human are not just a larger version of a baby. If you've ever looked at a baby heads take up like half of the baby's height. And imagine a human where half of your body was your head, right? That wouldn't work very well. Growth is getting larger, but development is also that change. And then all living things process energy, and energy is food. So this moth or butterfly here has its proboscis, it's drinking the nectar from this flower, and that's the food that it's eating. Us humans, we eat food in the form of cheeseburgers, or if you're vegetarian like me, Impossible burgers, right? Plants can also process energy, except they are able to make their own food. So plants are able to take energy from the sun, use photosynthesis, turn it into carbon that they can use. Another theme in biology is the idea of emergent properties. So every time, you can think about these hierarchies of organization as kind of a ladder. And every time we go up the ladder, we see new properties emerge. So the biosphere is going to be all the way up here at the top of this ladder, and we're going to get all the way down to little tiny atoms that make up the molecules of our body. We can see that the next higher step is made up of the components in the previous step. So the biosphere is the entire Earth. All of the different environments, all of the different land and aquatic environments that make up the planet. One step down from that is we have an ecosystem. This has living things and also abiotic, non-living things. So in here we've got trees, we've got grass, we've got several different species of wildflowers. There's no microorganisms in the soil. There's probably deer and rodents in the forest. And abiotic, we also have things like minerals and oxygen, CO2, water. So an ecosystem is going to be consisting of the living things, which is the community, as well as the non-living things. One step down from that is communities. So a community is all of the living things in an environment. So in here we've got the flowers, we've got the grasses, you have trees, there are deer here, the microorganisms in the soil, but a community would not include things like water. A population is all of the organisms of a single species. So now we're looking at this one single species of flower in this one area. So it's all of these organisms of the same species that have to be in the same area. Generally, a population would be organisms that are going to be able to reproduce with each other. So if we have these purple flowers in North America and then the same purple flowers in, Europe, it's not likely that the pollen from Europe is going to get to America on a normal standard basis, and so we wouldn't consider those the same population. A single organism is one plant here that's going to be made up of, the same DNA. So a single organism would be one human. Within an organism, we have different organs. So here, these are the leaf organs of the plant. The plant would also have flowers and a stem and some roots. And if you add up all those together in the right order, you could get the entire flowering plant. In a human, this would be things like your nervous system, your digestive system, your respiratory system. Inside of an organ, it is made up of tissues, and you can see in this image down here that this and this look slightly different. So those are different types of tissues. You as a human also have different types of tissues. You have nervous tissue, muscle tissue, connective tissue, and epithelial tissue. All of those tissues are made up of cells. So this is an individual cell. This is the smallest living thing. So everything below a cell cannot be considered living because one of the properties of life is that you are made up of cells. So a cell is the smallest thing that can be considered alive. Sometimes a cell is an entire organism. So in the case of prokaryotes or single-celled eukaryotes, the entire cell is the entire organism. They don't have multiple organs. But for you, in the case of humans and more complex organisms, a single cell only makes up a tiny, tiny component of your body. Inside of a cell, we have different organelles. So this is a chloroplast. This is what the plant is going to use to do photosynthesis. You have tiny organelles inside of your cells as well. You don't have the chloroplast, but you have some of the other same ones as plants, like nucleus, the mitochondria, the endoplasmic reticulum, the Golgi body. And then at the very, very smallest end of the spectrum, we have an entire molecule here made up of atoms. So each of these little circles is a single atom of a different element, and they're usually color-coded like this to tell me they're different. So the gray in here would be carbon, the white would be hydrogen, usually red is oxygen. So as we've kind of gone down this ladder, you can imagine that as you go up the ladder, new properties emerge from interaction of parts in a system. And I like to relate this to building IKEA furniture. So if you've never built IKEA furniture, you've probably built some kind of furniture, have seen furniture built. And when you get furniture from IKEA, it comes in a box and it is completely disassembled. Sometimes they don't even give you the drill you need, right? Or the screwdriver. So I bought a table, right? You get a table and you get 4 legs and you lay them out on the floor. I know they're not the same length, but just imagine that IKEA sells tables with 4 legs the same length, right? So I've laid out all of these slabs of wood on my floor. Does this have the properties of a table? Can I sit comfortably in a chair at this random slab of wood on the floor and eat my breakfast? The properties for the table don't emerge until you build it, right? So I put my table together, I put the 4 legs underneath it. That's my great drawing there. And then now I can sit at this table and I can eat my breakfast. As we go up, the thing that is changing is arrangement, so order. When we put organelles together into the correct order, we can make them a cell. And so every time we go up, new characters emerge. So this leads into this theme that I love. I think this is super important. The structure of something implies its function. And we're going to see this over and over and over and over again this semester. The shape of something tells us something about what it does. So some biologists study the shapes of things and then infer the function of it. Conversely, we can look at the function of something and we can take a guess at what it looks like. So this is really good for microbiology. If we know a cell is doing some kind of function, we may be able to kind of guess at what the structure of it, what it looks like. So the cell is the basic unit of structure. So this is because it is the smallest unit of living things. And you can see here we've got a prokaryotic cell over here, which is very small. They are very simple. They do not contain a nucleus or other membrane-bound organelles. You can see the DNA in here, and it's just kind of crumbled up together. And then there's ribosomes and a membrane. A eukaryotic cell is much larger, and this is an animal cell. And it's going to have multiple organelles in here. You can see all of the different organelles. It's got this really big nucleus here, which is bound by a membrane. And so the eukaryotic cells, we believe, evolved from prokaryotic cells, and the complexity evolved over time. Another theme that we're going to see towards the end of the class, pretty much the entire last exam, is going to focus on how we transform genetic information into the way organisms look and move and act. And this is called genetic expression. So all of our cells contain 46 chromosomes that contain your DNA, and this is your genetic material. This is your blueprints for your entire body. Inside of this, we have units of nucleic acids called genes, and these genes code for proteins. So they code for the proteins, the melanin in your skin, the keratin in your nails and hair, all of the things that make you physically you. And that expression of the genetics is called gene expression. So the expression of DNA is the proteins that we make from it. And so we will cover that whole mechanism later on in the semester. So here, just the basics of kind of the structure of DNA. You can see a DNA is made up of 2 strands. So here's the first strand here, and then here's the second strand there. And so if you untwist this, here's another ladder, it looks a little bit like a ladder. So this is what we call a double helix. And then the rungs of the ladder here, you can see, are made up of nucleotides. And we have 4 nucleotides. We have adenine, we have cytosine, we have thymine, and we have guanine. And And all together, those make up your entire genetic blueprints, those 4 nucleic acids in different sequences. So you see, what matters about DNA is what order do we put these A's and T's and G's and C's in. That's your genetic code. And if I switch the order of these around, it would switch up what your genes are telling you, and it would make a different protein. And so the expression would be different. Life also requires the transformation of energy and matter. And there's 2 key notes here: energy and matter. So energy ultimately comes from the sun. All of the energy on the planet comes from the sun, and it starts with producers. So the energy from the sun goes to the producers. Those are things that can do photosynthesis. Those are your plants, trees, grasses, flowers, and your algae and some photosynthetic bacteria. The bacteria, algae, and plants then get eaten by herbivores. So the consumers eat the producers, and now the energy has jumped up to things like rabbits and deer and Professor Abel's that only eat plants. Consumers are then eaten by secondary consumers, all you carnivores, and then so on and so on. Eventually, the energy gets completely lost from the system. Every time we have an energy conversion, right, so every time I drew an arrow, some energy is lost as heat. And this means that not much of the energy actually makes it up to the next level. Only about 10% of the energy from each jump gets converted to the next jump. And so majority of the energy is lost as heat. Eventually, an organism dies and it gets broken down, and its matter gets recycled. It's actual carbon and hydrogen and water. But the energy from the body gets lost as heat. So all of the energy flows through the system. This is our system, right? This is the Earth. It starts at the sun. It flows to the Earth. It goes to producers and then consumers. It gets lost as heat. And so eventually all of the energy from the sun eventually gets lost as heat. So this is what it means by moving through a system. The other component of life is matter. So those are the actual molecules and atoms that you're made up of. Those are chemicals. And those chemicals cycle through the system. So the chemicals have to stay on the planet. So if you think about a plant gets its carbon from the carbon dioxide in the air, and then it uses that to build sugars. And then a deer eats those sugars and uses that to build its own muscles. And then a bear eats the deer and uses that to build its own body. And then eventually the bear dies and some fungus breaks it down into carbon matter in the earth, which is then broken down into compost. That compost can be used as nutrients that then can give things like nitrogen, phosphorus, carbon to plants. And so the entire molecules that you're made up of have to go through a cycle. So here's a better drawing of that. So you can see the energy coming in, being converted from the plant to caterpillar here, and then eventually lost as heat as it goes through. The chemicals from the soil get taken up into the plant, into the caterpillar. Eventually the caterpillar dies. Our decomposers here, our fungus, break it down, return it to the soil. Here's another theme. So all of our molecules and ecosystems interact with each other. There is nothing in biology that works on its own. So a lot of times scientists will study just the function of one specific protein. And it's important to understand how individual parts work, but it's also important to understand that individual parts do not work on their own. They always work within a system. And that could be at a molecular level, cells next to each other communicating. That can be at a macro level of ecosystems and organisms communicating inside an ecosystem. One really, really important example of communication and connectedness is something called negative feedback. So let's go through an example of negative feedback. What temperature do you set the thermostat in your house, right? It's sitting at the wall, and my house currently says 74 degrees because we're trying to conserve energy, but it's also Florida. So 74 degrees. What happens when your house is hotter than 74 degrees? That's my fan, right? So when your house is hot, the fan kicks on. So let's draw a graph of time and temperature, right? If my house gets up to 75 degrees, the fan will kick on, and that will bring my temperature back down. What happens when my house gets back to 74? Does the fan keep blowing forever? I hope not, because that costs a lot of money. So once my temperature gets back down to 74, the fan turns off and we're going to stay there. And then eventually, because we live in Florida, it will get hot again. And as soon as it starts to register at 75, the fan will kick on and turn it back down. If we lived somewhere that was actually cold, you could do this metaphor with a heater to keep your house to a certain warmth. But the idea behind negative feedback is that it maintains homeostasis. So it is going to keep us at this level. And we use negative feedback not just for our temperature, but we use it for things like our blood sugar, our blood pressure, our pH balance, all sorts of chemical reactions inside of your body, the amount of protein we make, right? If a gene should be turned on or off based on the amount of proteins we have is an example of negative feedback. So in this example, you can see that insulin is being released when the amount of glucose or sugar in the blood is very high. And then eventually that insulin allows the sugar to get taken up into cells. And then when that sugar is low, the insulin gets inhibited, that's the negative part, and it turns back off. So this is maintaining our blood sugar homeostasis. At an ecosystem level, we see interactions with other organizations. Some of those are beneficial, some of them can be harmful. So things like mutualisms are going to be beneficial to both organisms. Parasites, predation, even herbivory is harmful to one of the interactions.